So picking up right where I left off in the last video, I'm going to be doing the tops just like the bottoms. They're going to fit in place very similarly. You can see I'm going to have to put the miter on the edge of these as well. With this in place, you can see just how the joints don't fully fit. So I could pop them out, and like I said, I kind of realized that sawing these was going to be the fastest way to do it. And I could just cut those 45s right on the edge. You clean them up with a little bit of a chisel, round them over just a little bit, and then everything fit into place quite nicely. So that's what that looks like with the haunch on there and the double tenons. So this will be a nice solid joint. The frame is never going to come apart. It is quite a large piece of furniture, but with all the mechanical parts, getting everything to maneuver was going to be hard enough. If this came apart and had to be reassembled, it was going to be that much more of a nightmare. So at this point I could start gluing this together, and I didn't have pipe clamps long enough. They were just short enough to not work, so I've had success with using strap clamps. You can see all the surface area that's going to get glue for this, which will just make the whole thing stronger. I'm going to do two sides at a time, and then I'm going to glue those two sides together to make my life a little bit easier. I didn't think I'd be able to glue the whole thing together. This is Titebond 3. The open time of this is only a little over 20 minutes. So I didn't want to have to worry about the glue setting up before I could get it done. The thing about using these strap clamps, like I said, they're working really well, especially for this sort of low profile application. But you just want to make sure your legs or whatever you're using don't twist. Sometimes all of that force on the outside edge like that could make the legs twist, so just make sure they're staying square. Now, since I'm doing this in two sets, you could see I was making sure to remove excess glue out of that joint so that everything would still line up. Now the middle part of this is going to be getting a 3/4 inch plywood partition. I'm going to be attaching that with dados. So the two bottom stretchers and the two top aprons are going to be getting a dado, and then that's going to separate the two sides. One side's going to have a large lift top. The other side will have a smaller lift top as well as storage drawers. So not only will this separate the two sides, and then I'll be able to make bases for all of that, which will be later in this video, but it will also hold the frame together a little bit down the center. So it's just going to add some structure, and I'm basically building the whole design off this center piece. So I just used the radial arm saw to cut that. It's a very shallow dado. It's not necessarily holding this all together. The mortise and tenons are going to be doing that, but putting a dado on the corners like that will ensure that it's the same distance off both sides. So once I had that done, I could cut this down. It's going to be the same height as the base, which is 18.5. So like I said, this is a 3/4 inch red oak. I was really trying to pay attention to how heavy this was going to be, not only if the customer ever wants to move it, but transporting this was already going to be a pain. If I kept building with 3/4 inch ply, it would just be extremely heavy. So after this, I spent a little more time trying to think of ways to make this without using thicker ply. So this is just dry fitting the whole thing together. Once I had that dry fit, I can measure for the width of the ply. Now I had to be careful because you could see, even though these boards are pretty nice, just naturally on a span this long, they're going to bow a little bit. So I transferred the depth of that dado to the edge, and I measured the distance from the two edges instead of the middle to make sure I had an exact measurement. So that's basically, I know that the camera work on these where I'm trying to hold and film is always a little jerky, and I apologize, but I got that measurement on the side. You could see it's a little over 55 3/4 in the middle. I have a stop set up on the other edge, which is the same depth. You can see it's 55 11/16 down here. That might not seem like that huge of a deal, but stuff like that makes a big difference down the line, especially if there's so many components going into something like this. So I spent the extra time to make sure I was getting the right measurement, and then I could just use the radial arm saw to cut this down. You will not really see most of this plywood, so the radial arm saw sometimes leaves some chip on the edge of this, but like I said, I'm going to cover up the ends. You're really only ever going to see one side of it. And then I could slide that into place. So like I said, this is all dry fit. My camera cut out during the glue up of this, so you kind of get the basic idea of how this is going to be glued up. It's the exact same principle. I'm going to be using strap clamps again around the whole perimeter of the piece, and then that central piece, I don't believe I think I used that just to keep everything square. I don't think I glued that in until a little bit later. So that's kind of floating in the center. I made sure for the dry fit before I glued it, everything was square. Like I said, going forward, if these inner partitions I made, these two segments weren't square, it was just going to complicate my life. So like I said, I started with the glue up, and then my camera died. And unfortunately, whenever that happens during glue ups especially, you don't notice till the end. But that is basically what I was left with. Like I said, I just have those strap clamps around the entire perimeter, measured my diagonals, made sure everything was square before the glue had time to set up, and I was pretty happy with this. So the next day I could come in and take off the clamps. Now I'll be working on this table for a little bit. The big problem with larger things is just having the floor space to work on them. So I flipped this upside down because I was going to work on it on the table, and that just wasn't going to happen. So I eventually move it to the floor, and then I eventually move it to some sawhorses, which is where it is now. Now, like I said, this is not glued in place just yet, but in order to hold it in place, I put some screws in there. You will not see this until way at the end of the video because I didn't do it till the end. These screws will be replaced with dowels, but for the time being, I just use screws. So the rest of this video is going to be building out the two bases which will hold the 1/4 inch plywood which I'm using for the piece. The bottom is going to have basically shelves. One will be open, one will be holding drawers, but because of the hardware I'm using, that will also have plywood. The top is basically going to be a fairly deep voided area, and that is to hold all the hardware for the lifted tops. That's one of the reasons the aprons are so thick. They're thick because it's a very large piece of furniture. I built it similarly to the sizes I would use if I was building a larger table, but also because I needed that area in order to hold all the hardware. So I could have made this also out of oak, but that would have been really expensive and also heavy. You will never see these, especially on a coffee table. It's so low to the ground. So I decided to go with Douglas fir, which is a nicer grade of 2x4, and I ripped this down so it's a little bit nice. 2x4s are actually not so bad once you take them out of being a 2x4. If you rip them into smaller strips, sometimes I'll even use them in finished furniture. So basically all I'm going to do is make 4 frame perimeters with slats in the middle, and that will hold everything up. So I'm going to start by putting some pieces on the back and the front, and those are just cut to size. Now the problem is I can't really add any depth to this because, like I said, I need all the depth I can get, especially on the top. So everything's going to be lapped together. I would probably have done this anyway because this is a very long span. The laps are extremely strong joint, and it makes it so that this will be the same dimension thickness as when I cut it. So these pieces are about 1.5 inches, and they're almost 1 inch thick. That's kind of the basic measurement I'm going with. So you can see I just have my 2 edges will have runners going across, and then I think I split this up into 4 in the middle. Just roughly split it. It's not super important if these are evenly spaced, and you can kind of see where those are at. At this point I didn't have the hardware for the big lift. I kind of wish I did because I would have based my spacing off of that. And then I did a test cut of the laps. I made sure everything was flush. This is basically just getting the depth set right on the radial arm saw, and then I'm going to go through and put laps on all those marks. in order to make my life a little bit easier and to orient these perfectly, because it is important that these line up perfectly on the top, I decided to take my 2 pieces. So I'm basically making 4 quadrants now, 2 tops and 2 bottoms. So I'm going to screw together my 2 tops on the right, my 2 tops on the left, and the same for the bottom, and cut my dados all at once. So when I take these apart, the dimensions are perfectly square front to back with each other, as well as side to side. So it also helps that it will cut down on how much of these I have to cut when they're screwed together. So all I'm going to do, the most important cuts for these are going to be my reference lines. So I'm going to go through and cut all of my reference lines. One in the front is shorter, obviously, because the legs stick into the inner portion of the cabinet. So that's why those are shorter. And I just have a stop set up. Once I have all of those cut, I'm going to move it over, line it up with my next mark, set the stop, and then at this point I have 4 sets of 2 pieces, and I cut all of the pieces exactly the same. So you can see I have it lined up there. I could cut that first line, and then I'll slide it over and cut the second line. Usually I will cut all of these the lap joint openings all at once, but like I said, for this front to back, it's really important that these are square. So I spent the time doing all my reference marks first, and then I'll go through and clear out the other material. So I'm always using this original piece with the marks on it as my reference. You can see I'm going to set it up. I'll cut this one, flip it around to the other side because they're the same distance off the edge, and cut those, and then do the exact same thing for the other pieces that I have screwed together. So you can see I'm flipping it. So I'm basically cutting 2 dados at once as well on one piece. Cut, flip, cut again, and then get another one. So that is what I am left with. Everything looks like it's lining up perfectly, which is exactly what I want. And then I could go through and very quickly just cut a bunch of kerfs and remove all the rest of that material. So like I said, those 2 border cuts are the most important. Those designate the thickness of the piece. I don't want these to be loose at all. I want them to be nice and tight so that when they're glued together, it's super strong, so that they can not only span the 5 feet, but they can hold up everything that's going to be in the cabinet. And then I just did this for all of them. You can take a chisel and just remove those kerfs. The other nice thing about working with pine is it's really easy to clean up the material because it is in fact a soft wood. So there is all of my cuts, and at this point, obviously I did this before, but I could check and make sure that these fit, and then I could just unscrew them and put them back the way that they were. So that is what that looks like. So I was using a laser level to help with this, but the top portion and the bottom portion were going to be assembled a little bit differently. I'm also using some key stock on the bottom, basically because I'm putting 1/4 inch plywood on top of all of this. I mounted this 1/4 inch below the runner I have on the bottom, so that was pretty important to get that right. The plywood I have is a true 1/4 inch. You could see I just used the key stock and the laser to mount these 1/4 inch below, and I screw them all in. And then the front's a little easier because I could use clamps, but same thing. You could see the little lip I'm creating by mounting them lower, and then the plywood will slide right into place here. So that is the front. I'm using drywall screws for this, but I do go in and swap out with wood screws. I don't mind using drywall screws for certain things, but for this, especially when I'm drilling into the hardwood, drywall screws are extremely brittle, so I did go out and buy some wood screws for that. And then for the top portion, basically this is going to be in the same dimension as the bottom of the apron. So once again, I was using the laser level, but basically the bottom of this rail I'm putting in is lined up with the bottom of the apron, so I could keep all of the depth that I needed for this. And once again, I could just keep screwing that in. This will also all come apart and be glued. I don't think I show that in this video, but all of these will be glued, and then they're really solid. And you could just see, especially on the top, how this is starting to create the cavities that I need for the storage on the top. So then to do all the slats, it's actually really simple. That my base was nice and square, so both sides were the exact same length, I can go through, set up my stop initially, and just cut laps on both sides of all of my pieces. So you can see I had a bunch already pre-cut. I went through, when I cut up the initial 2x4s, I made enough for all of this material, so I just went through on the crosscuts saw and cut them down to length, and then I can add the laps, clean them up once again, and then all of these will also pop into place. So it is a little more time consuming, but the nice thing about stuff like this, and I always say this about certain joints, is it really does hold itself together. You don't really need a lot of hardware, and then once you put glue on this stuff, it's extremely solid. So then here's going to be my pieces, and the two openings on either side is about 24 inches. So the span I have is just about enough, especially since I'm going to be attaching plywood on top. I'm not really nervous about any of this sagging. I can't think of someone who would have a coffee table much bigger than this, but if your span for that going across was closer to 3 foot, I think you would need another partition in there, but I didn't for this. And then for the corners, I decided to just cut out around. Technically, I probably just could have had the corners because I'm going to be screwing them in, but it wasn't too hard to notch these out so that they fit in the corners there. So I'm just I mark those up based on the legs. I can extend my lines, and then I just use the handsaw for this. Like I said, the nice thing about softwood is, even though I don't use it a ton for building, is especially compared to stuff like oak, which I use a lot, it's much faster to cut, faster to clean up. Not as nice, obviously, but it is a little faster to work with. And then these corners, the back is a regular lap, but the front will fit into that corner. So there is the basic frame. Like I said, later on I will glue this together. You kind of see how I'm creating the basis for this, the voids to hold all of that material, the bottom for the pieces, and it's super solid even without having glue on it.